The blood-red sunset stained the horizon as Faith Blackwell clutched her trembling sister's hand, watching in horror as their uncle, Tobias, haggled with a stranger over their very lives. It was 1876 in Fort Benton, Montana, and at 18, Faith had never imagined she'd be treated as mere currency in exchange for whiskey. $10 and they're both yours, Tobias slurred, swaying slightly as he waved a hastily scrawled contract. Pretty ones, ain't they? Can cook, clean, and the older ones got away with horses. Faith's stomach twisted with revulsion. After their parents' death from typhoid fever 6 months ago, their father's brother had seemed their only option. They'd quickly discovered his true nature, a drunkard with gambling debts, who viewed his nieces as burdens rather than family. $20 for both, the stranger countered, his face partially hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in well-worn riding clothes that spoke of long days in the saddle. 14-year-old Florence squeezed Faith's hand so hard it hurt. "He can't do this," she whispered. "Can he?" Faith had no answer. In this wild territory, law often yielded to whoever had the strongest will or quickest draw. Their meager possessions sat packed in 2 small bags at their feet, all that remained of their former life. "Done," Tobias agreed eagerly, snatching the money and shoving the crude contract at the stranger. "Sign here, and they're yours legal-like." The stranger's gloved hand accepted the paper, and to Faith's surprise, he turned slightly to meet her gaze. His eyes were startlingly blue beneath the brim of his hat, not cold or leering as she expected, but unreadable. "Name's Preston Pratt," he said, his voice deep and even. "I own the Triple P Ranch 10 miles south of here." Faith lifted her chin, determined not to show fear despite the trembling in her knees. "We are not property to be sold," she said, her voice barely steady. A flicker of something respect, perhaps, crossed the man's expression before he turned back to her uncle. He signed the paper with deliberate strokes, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. "Get your things," Preston Pratt instructed Faith and Florence before turning back to their uncle. "Our business is done." Tobias was already eyeing the saloon doors, the money clutched in his grimy hand. "Pleasure doing business," he muttered, already forgetting them in anticipation of whiskey. Faith grabbed their bags, keeping Florence close as they followed the stranger to his wagon parked outside. Her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. What did this man want with them? Was working at his ranch merely a polite term for something far worse? "Get in," Preston said, helping Florence up before offering his hand to Faith. She ignored it, climbing up herself. "What exactly do you intend for us, Mr. Pratt?" Preston secured their bags and moved to the front of the wagon. "That depends." "On what?" Faith demanded, her fear transforming to anger. He clicked his tongue at the horses and set them moving before answering. "On whether you'd rather stay in that situation back there or take a chance on something different." They traveled in tense silence through the main street of Fort Benton. The town was bustling despite the late-hour miners, travelers, and locals moved between the trading posts, saloons, and hotels that serviced the steady steamboat traffic on the Missouri River. When they reached the edge of town, Preston unexpectedly pulled the wagon to a stop. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the contract, holding it up for them to see. "This," he said quietly, "is not worth the paper it's written on." Before Faith could respond, he struck a match against the wagon seat and touched it to the corner of the document. The paper caught quickly, flames licking along its edges. Preston held it until the fire nearly reached his fingers before dropping the burning contract to the dirt and grinding it under his boot. "No man has the right to sell another human being," he said, looking directly at Faith. "Not in this territory, not anywhere." Faith stared at the smoldering remains, struggling to understand. Then why? Why did I buy you? Preston adjusted his hat. Because it was the fastest way to get you both away from that sorry excuse for a man. Florence looked up, hope dawning on her young face. You're not taking us to be servants. A hint of a smile touched Preston's lips. My ranch needs help, that's true. But you'll be paid fair wages for honest work if you choose to stay. Or I can take you to Helena where the sisters had sent. Mary's mission might help you find placement elsewhere. Faith felt dizzy with confusion and relief. Why would you help strangers this way? Preston's gaze turned distant, looking out across the prairie. Let's just say I recognize a bad situation when I see one. He clicked to the horses again, setting them back in motion. We've got a few hours' ride ahead. You can decide what you want to do by the time we reach the ranch. As the wagon rolled away from Fort Benton, Faith watched the town disappear in the gathering darkness. She had no reason to trust this man, yet something about his straightforward manner and the burning of that contract stirred a cautious hope within her. "What's your ranch like?" Florence asked, her natural curiosity emerging now that immediate danger had passed. "It's nothing fancy," Preston replied. 400 acres, decent grazing land, a small creek running through it. The house needs work, but it's solid. I've got about 60 head of cattle, 8 horses, some chickens. Do you live alone?" Faith asked, trying to gauge what they might be walking into. Preston nodded. "My foreman, Silas Weaver, has a cabin on the property. There's a cook, May Lynn. She came west after working on the railroad. Good woman, terrible temper if you're late to meals. And 2 cowhands, brothers from Texas." The information settled Faith's nerves somewhat. Other people around meant potential allies if this man's intentions proved false. As they traveled through the darkness, Faith observed their rescuer. Preston Pratt appeared to be in his late 20s, with the weathered look of someone who spent most days outdoors. His movements were efficient, his attention continually scanning their surroundings. He carried a revolver at his hip, not unusual in these territories, but she noted he didn't have the flashy gun belt or exaggerated swagger of men trying to prove something. "How long have you been in Montana territory?" she asked, breaking a long silence. 3 years, he answered. "Came up from Colorado after purchasing the ranch from a widow returning east." "And before Colorado," Preston glanced at her with a raised eyebrow, "you ask a lot of questions." "My sister and I were just sold for whiskey money," Faith replied evenly. "I think I'm entitled to know something about the man who bought us." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair enough. I grew up in Pennsylvania. My father was a blacksmith. I headed west after the war." "Which side?" Faith couldn't help asking. "Union," Preston answered simply. "Was at Gettysburg. After that, I'd seen enough of the East to last a lifetime." The conversation faded as Florence's head grew heavy against Faith's shoulder. Eventually, her sister fell asleep, lulled by the rhythmic movement of the wagon. "She'll be all right," Preston said quietly, noticing Faith's concerned glance at her sister. "Children are resilient." "Florence is 14, Faith corrected. "Not quite a child anymore." Preston nodded. "And you?" 18 last month. They traveled in silence for a while longer, the only sounds the creaking wagon wheels and the steady hoof beats of the team. The moon rose, painting the rolling landscape in silver light. "What skills do you have?" Preston finally asked. Faith straightened. "I can read and write, do figures. Our mother taught us both. I can cook and I know horses. Our father bred them before he died." "And your sister?" "Florence has a gift with plants, can make anything grow. She's also quick with numbers." Preston nodded thoughtfully. "Those are useful skills at Triple P." As the night deepened, Preston pointed out landmarks, distant butts, a river crossing, the silhouette of mountains against the horizon. Faith found herself memorizing the route, not entirely trusting that she wouldn't need an escape path. It was well past midnight when they crested a small rise, and Preston reined the horses to a stop. "There it is," he said, gesturing toward a cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley. A creek reflected moonlight as it curved around the property, and Faith could make out the shapes of a main house, a barn, and several outbuildings. Faith gently woke Florence, who blinked sleepily at the ranch below them. "It's pretty," her sister murmured. "It's home," Preston replied simply, urging the team forward again. As they approached, a dog began to bark, and a lantern light appeared at the main house. A short, roundish woman emerged onto the porch, shielding the lantern with one hand. "You're late, Preston Pratt," she called out, her accent revealing her Chinese heritage. "Food is cold now." "Sorry, Mei Lin," Preston answered as he brought the wagon to a stop. "Had unexpected business in town." The woman approached, her shrewd gaze taking in Faith and Florence. "What's this?" "You bring guests at this hour. This is Faith and Florence Blackwell," Preston explained, helping Florence down from the wagon. "Ladies, this is Mei Lin, the best cook in Montana Territory." Mei Lin sniffed disapprovingly, though Faith thought she detected a hint of pleasure at the compliment. "Girls look hungry. Come inside. I have stew." Faith hesitated before accepting Preston's offered hand to descend from the wagon. His grip was steady and warm, releasing her as soon as her feet touched the ground. "We'll talk more tomorrow," he said. "For tonight, you'll stay in the spare room. Get some rest, eat something." Faith nodded, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. "Thank you," she said stiffly, still not entirely certain of their situation. Preston's expression softened slightly. "You're safe here, Miss Blackwell. You have my word on that." Something in his steady gaze made Faith believe him, at least for the moment. She gathered their bags and followed Mei Lin, keeping Florence close as they entered the ranch house. The interior was simple but clean, a main room with a stone fireplace, solid wooden furniture worn smooth with use. A kitchen occupied one end where Mei Lin immediately went to work reheating food. A hallway presumably led to bedrooms. Sit," Mei Lin instructed, pointing to the table. "No good standing there like lost calves." Florence giggled at the description, earning a quick smile from the cook. "Mr. Pratt said you work here," Faith ventured as they sat. 4 years now," Mei Lin confirmed, placing bowls of hearty beef stew before them. "Since ranch was nothing but broken-down shack and skinny cows, Preston good man. Works too hard, needs wife." Faith nearly choked on her first spoonful. "We're not," Mei Lin waved dismissively. "Not saying you, just saying." She bustled away, muttering in Chinese. Despite her discomfort at the implication, Faith couldn't deny the stew was delicious. Both sisters ate ravenously, realizing they hadn't had a proper meal since morning. Preston entered as they were finishing, having seen to the horses. He removed his hat and hung it on a peg by the door, running a hand through dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "Everything all right?" he asked, accepting a bowl from Mei Lin with a nod of thanks. "Yes," Faith answered for them both. "We appreciate the meal." "Good stew," Florence added. "Better than what Uncle Tobias gave us." Faith shot her sister a warning look, but Preston merely nodded. "Mei Lin will show you to your room," he said. "We rise early here, but you're welcome to rest as long as you need tomorrow. We can discuss arrangements after that." Faith studied him across the table. "What exactly do you expect from us, Mr. Pratt?" Preston set down his spoon. "Honesty. Hard work if you choose to stay. Beyond that, nothing you're not willing to give." Their eyes locked, and Faith felt a peculiar sensation in her chest, like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. She nodded slightly. "We can manage that." Later, in the small but comfortable bedroom they'd been given, Faith sat on the edge of the bed watching Florence brush out her hair. The younger girl's expression was thoughtful. "You think we can trust him?" Florence asked quietly. Faith considered the question carefully. "I don't know yet. But he did burn that contract, and he could have. Well, he could have treated us much worse." "I like it here," Florence decided, climbing beneath the quilt. "And that Chinese lady is nice, even if she pretends to be grumpy." Despite her exhaustion, Faith found sleep elusive. She stood at the window, looking out at the ranch bathed in moonlight. In the distance, she could make out a figure, Preston, walking a slow perimeter around the property, rifle cradled in his arm, standing guard. Perhaps, just perhaps, they had found safety after all. Morning arrived with the crowing of roosters and the bustling sounds of a ranch coming to life. Faith woke disoriented before remembering the events of the previous day. Florence still slept soundly beside her, looking younger and more vulnerable in sleep. Faith dressed quickly in her worn calico dress, splashed water on her face from the basin provided, and twisted her light brown hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. She would let Florence sleep a bit longer. The kitchen was already active when Faith emerged. Mei Lin worked efficiently at the stove while a wizened man sat at the table nursing a cup of coffee. "Good morning," Faith said hesitantly. The man looked up, revealing a deeply lined face beneath a shock of white hair. "So you're one of the girls Preston brought back," he said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "Sela's weaver. I run things when the boss is elsewhere." "Faith Blackwell," she replied, accepting the cup of coffee Mei Lin thrust into her hands. "My sister Florence is still sleeping." "As she should be," Mei Lin declared. "Growing girls need rest." Faith sipped the strong coffee. "Is Mr. Pratt around?" "Checking the north pasture fence," Sela's answered. "Been up since before dawn. Said to tell you he'd be back mid-morning to talk." Faith nodded, uncertain what to do next. "Can I help with anything?" Mei Lin eyed her appraisingly. "You know how to make biscuits?" "Yes, madam." "Good. Flour in bin. Make 2 dozen." Faith set to work, grateful for the familiar task. As she mixed the dough, 2 young men entered, the Texas brothers, she presumed. They introduced themselves as Hank and Joe Delgado, regarding her with curious but respectful nods before digging into the breakfast Mei Lin served. By the time Florence appeared, rubbing sleep from her eyes, the kitchen was bustling with activity and conversation. Faith watched her sister carefully, but the girl seemed to bloom under the attention, especially when Mei Lin praised her manners. Preston returned as promised, stomping dust from his boots before entering the house. He looked tired but satisfied. "Fence is fixed," he announced to Sela's. "Should hold through spring thaw." His gaze found Faith, who was helping Mei Lin wash dishes. "Miss Blackwell, if you have a moment." Faith dried her hands and followed Preston to the porch, where they could speak privately. The morning was crisp but warming quickly, the vast Montana sky stretching endlessly above them. "I imagine you have questions," Preston began, leaning against the porch rail. Faith nodded. "Several. Ask them." "Why did you really help us?" Faith began. "The truth." Preston considered this, looking out across his land. "I was in Fort Benton for supplies. Saw your uncle dragging you 2 into the Broken Spoke, heard him bragging about having merchandise to trade. It wasn't hard to figure out what he meant." He shifted uncomfortably. "I've seen what happens to young women with no protection out here. Didn't sit right with me, leaving you to that fate." "So it was pity," Faith concluded, a hint of defensiveness in her voice. Preston's gaze sharpened. "Call it whatever you like, Miss Blackwell. I call it basic human decency." Faith flushed. "I apologize. We're grateful, truly. I need to understand our situation." Preston's expression softened. "Fair enough. Here's what I propose. You and your sister stay on for 2 weeks, see if the ranch suits you. I'll pay you each a fair wage for whatever work you can do. After that, you decide stay on with continued employment, or I'll arrange safe passage to Helena or wherever else you'd like to go." Faith studied him, looking for any sign of deception. "And we're free to leave. Anytime. This isn't a prison, Miss Blackwell. Though I'd appreciate notice if you decide to go." Faith nodded slowly. 2 weeks, then." Preston pushed away from the railing. "Good. Now, Sela's mentioned you know horses." "My father raised Morgans in Illinois before we came west. I helped with training." A hint of approval crossed Preston's face. "We've got a mare about to foal. Could use someone with a gentle touch keeping an eye on her." For the first time since their parents' deaths, Faith felt a spark of genuine interest. "I'd like that." Preston nodded. "I'll show you the barn after you finish helping Mei Lin." The next days fell into a rhythm that surprised Faith with its comfort. She spent mornings helping Mei Lin with household tasks and afternoons in the barn, primarily caring for the pregnant mare, a beautiful bay named Copper. Florence, meanwhile, had discovered the ranch's neglected kitchen garden and thrown herself into reviving it, with Mei Lin's enthusiastic approval. On their 4th day, Faith was brushing Copper when Preston entered the barn. She'd grown somewhat more at ease around him, though she remained cautious. "How is she?" Preston asked, approaching the stall. "Getting close," Faith answered. "See how she's carrying, I'd guess within the week." Preston nodded, reaching out to stroke the mare's nose. "She was my first purchase for the ranch. Special girl." Faith watched the gentleness in his hands, the affection in his eyes. It was a side of him she hadn't fully seen before. "You have a good way with her," Preston commented. "Most horses take to you right away." Faith smiled slightly. "My father said I had the touch. He taught me that horses respond to what's in your heart more than what's in your hands." "Wise man," Preston said. "Wish I could have met him." "Me too," Faith replied softly. "He would have liked you, I think." The words slipped out before she could consider them, and Faith busied herself with the brush to hide her confusion. Why had she said that? If Preston noticed her discomfort, he didn't comment. Instead, he said, "Ride with me tomorrow. I need to check the western boundary and it's good country. Thought you might enjoy getting beyond the barnyard." Faith hesitated only briefly. "I'd like that." The next morning they set out just after sunrise. Preston had saddled a gentle gelding for Faith, and she felt a rush of pleasure as they rode side by side across the rolling grassland. The ranch was more beautiful than she'd initially realized, with distant mountains framing lush valleys and clear streams. "How did you find this place?" Faith asked as they paused atop a ridge, the ranch buildings tiny in the distance. "Luck," Preston answered, removing his hat to wipe his brow. "I was heading to Oregon originally. Stopped in Fort Benton for supplies and heard about a widow selling cheap. Her husband had been killed by a falling tree and she couldn't manage alone." He replaced his hat, shading his eyes against the sun. "Moment I saw this valley, I knew. Some places just speak to you." Faith understood completely. Despite everything, she felt a connection to this land already. "What about you?" Preston asked. "How did you end up with your uncle?" Faith's expression clouded. "Our parents died of typhoid 6 months ago. We had no other family except Tobias, who was in Montana. He wrote that we should join him." She shook her head. "We didn't know then what he was really like." "I'm sorry," Preston said quietly. "Losing family is hard." Something in his tone made Faith look at him more closely. "You sound like you know." Preston was silent for a long moment. "Lost my parents young, raised by my grandfather until he passed. Then it was just me." "Until you came west," Faith supplied. "Until I came west," he agreed. "Best decision I ever made." They rode on, checking fence lines and water sources. Preston pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the land's history. Faith found herself laughing at his dry observations and relaxing in his company. By the time they returned to the ranch in late afternoon, something had shifted between them. Not dramatic, but noticeable a ease that hadn't existed before. As they unsaddled the horses, Preston said, "You ride well, Miss Blackwell." "Faith," she corrected, surprising herself. "If we're going to be working together, you might as well use my given name." A smile touched his lips. "Faith, then. And I'm Preston to everyone except Mei Lin, who insists on using both names as if scolding a child." Their laughter mingled in the dusty air of the barn. That evening, as Faith helped Florence braid her hair before bed, her sister looked up with shrewd eyes. "You like him, don't you?" Florence asked. Faith's hand stilled momentarily. "He's been kind to us." "That's not what I mean," Florence persisted. "You look at him differently now." "Don't be silly," Faith deflected, resuming the braiding. "I'm just grateful we found somewhere safe." Florence wasn't convinced but let the subject drop. As they settled into bed, she whispered, "I want to stay here, Faith. After the 2 weeks." Faith sighed, stroking her sister's hair. "We'll see, Flo, we'll see." The next morning, Faith woke before dawn with a strange certainty. She dressed quickly and made her way to the barn, guided by instinct. Sure enough, Copper was in labor, pacing her stall with the unmistakable signs of contractions. Faith immediately prepared clean straw and sent the young ranch hand Joe to fetch Preston. She spoke soothingly to the mare, monitoring her progress with experienced eyes. Preston arrived quickly, hair tousled from sleep but fully alert. "How is she?" "Progressing normally," Faith assured him. "First foal is always hardest, but she's strong." They worked together as the sun rose, Faith's calm competence matching Preston's steady presence. When complications arose, the foal slightly malpositioned, they moved in silent coordination to assist the mare. Finally, with a rush of fluid and a last powerful push from Copper, the foal slid into the world. Faith quickly cleared its nostrils and mouth while Preston supported its head. "A colt," Faith announced, smiling broadly as the wobbly newborn took his first breaths. "And a fine one." Preston's face reflected her joy as they watched Copper nuzzle her baby. "You were amazing," he said quietly. "I've seen births before, but never handled one so smoothly." Faith felt a flush of pride warm her cheeks. "My father would say the mare did all the real work." "Your father trained you well," Preston replied, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment. Something electric passed between them, acknowledgement of shared triumph, perhaps, or something deeper. Faith looked away first, focusing on helping the foal find his mother's milk. By breakfast time, news of the successful birth had spread through the ranch. Florence insisted on seeing the colt immediately after eating, her excitement contagious as she cooed over the spindly-legged creature. "What will you name him?" she asked Preston. "I think Faith should have that honor," Preston replied. She ensured he arrived safely. Faith considered the colt with his chestnut coat and single white sock. "Sunrise," she decided, "because that's when he joined us." Preston nodded approvingly. "Sunrise it is." The days that followed brought a subtle shift to Faith's position at the ranch. No longer just a guest or temporary worker, she found herself consulted on matters beyond the horses. Preston sought her opinion on a new grazing rotation, while Silas asked for her help with supply inventories. Impressed by her neat handwriting and quick calculations, Florence, meanwhile, had transformed the kitchen garden and begun helping Mei Lin with preserving early summer vegetables. The cook had taken a particular shine to the younger girl, teaching her Chinese words and remedies alongside cooking techniques. One evening, nearly at the end of their 2-week trial period, Faith found Preston alone on the porch. The setting sun painted the sky in spectacular oranges and purples, a sight that still took her breath away. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Preston said as she joined him. "I've never seen sunsets like Montana's," Faith agreed. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Preston spoke again. "Your 2 weeks are almost up," Faith nodded, suddenly tense. "Yes. Have you and Florence decided what you want to do?" Faith turned to face him. "Florence wants to stay. She's happy here." "And you?" Preston asked, his voice carefully neutral. Faith looked out at the land that had begun to feel like home with surprising speed. "I'm inclined to stay as well, if the offer still stands." Relief flickered across Preston's face. "It does. More than that, I'd like to make a proposal." Faith raised an eyebrow, waiting. "The small cabin near the creek, it needs some work, but it could be yours and Florence's. Private space, separate from the main house. You'd still take meals with us, but you'd have your own home." Faith hadn't expected this. "That's very generous," Preston shrugged. "It makes sense. You're both valuable to the ranch, and I suspect Florence would plant flowers around it within a week." Faith laughed softly. "Probably overnight, knowing her." Their eyes met, and Faith felt that same inexplicable connection she'd experienced in the barn. This time, neither looked away. "There's something else," Preston said, his voice lower. "Something I should have told you sooner." Faith's heart quickened. "What is it?" "The real reason I was so quick to intervene with your uncle." Preston took a breath. "My mother and sister were sold by my father to cover gambling debts when I was away fighting. By the time I returned home, they were gone. I spent years searching but never found them." Faith's hand went to her mouth. "Preston, I'm so sorry." He shook his head. "I tell you this not for sympathy, but because you should know. When I saw your uncle with that contract, I saw my father. I couldn't stand by again." Faith reached out impulsively, touching his arm. "Thank you for telling me, and for what you did." Preston covered her hand with his own, warm and calloused. "I want you to stay, Faith, both of you, but especially you." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Faith felt something shift in her heart, barriers beginning to crumble. "I want that too," she whispered. Their moment was interrupted by Florence calling from inside, but something had changed, a boundary crossed, a possibility acknowledged. The next week brought new rhythms. Faith and Florence moved into the creek cabin, which the entire ranch had helped repair and furnish. It was simple but cozy, with 2 small bedrooms, a main room with a fireplace, and a tiny kitchen. Florence immediately began transplanting wildflowers around the perimeter, just as Preston had predicted. Faith found herself working more closely with Preston, riding out to check cattle and learning the business side of ranching. Their conversations flowed easily now, punctuated by shared observations and occasional laughter. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, how he listened intently when she spoke, the gentle way he handled even the most difficult animals. One afternoon, they stopped to rest by a stream after checking a distant herd. Faith removed her boots and cooled her feet in the clear water while Preston lounged nearby, hat tipped over his eyes against the sun. "I never thought I'd end up here," Faith mused aloud. "When we left Illinois, I imagined a small town, perhaps teaching school eventually." Preston pushed his hat back to look at her. "Do you regret it? Coming west?" Faith considered this, watching minnows dart around her toes. "No," she finally said. "Despite everything, losing our parents, Tobias's betrayal, I can't regret the path that led here." Preston sat up, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Faith," he began, then hesitated. "I'm not good with fancy words, never have been, but these past weeks with you and Florence here, the ranch feels different, better." Faith felt warmth spread through her chest. "It feels like home," she admitted. "More than anywhere since we lost our parents." "It could be," Preston said quietly. "You're home permanently." Faith looked at him questioningly. Preston moved closer, taking her hand in his. "I'm not proposing yet, that would be too soon, and you deserve proper courting. But I'd like your permission to court you, Faith Blackwell." Faith's breath caught. Despite the growing attraction between them, she hadn't expected this direct acknowledgement so soon. "You hardly know me," she pointed out. Preston's thumb traced circles on her palm. "I know enough. I know you're brave and fiercely protective of your sister. I know you have a gift with animals and a mind for business. I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met." His blue eyes held hers. "Most importantly, I know that when you're around, everything seems brighter somehow, like the world has more possibilities." Faith felt tears prick her eyes at his simple, heartfelt words. "Yes," she whispered, "you have my permission." The smile that broke across Preston's face was like sunrise after a storm, brilliant and full of promise. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was brief, but perfect, a question and answer all at once. When they parted, Faith knew with sudden certainty that her life had changed irrevocably, and for the better. Word of their courtship spread quickly through the small ranch community. May Lynn was especially pleased, informing Faith that she had seen this coming since first night. Florence's reaction was a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Does this mean we'll stay forever?" she asked Faith that night as they sat by their cabin's fireplace. "Would that be all right with you?" Faith asked carefully. Florence nodded, then bit her lip. "But what if? What if you marry him? Will there still be place for me?" Faith pulled her sister into a fierce hug. "Florence Blackwell, listen to me. You are my family, my priority. Nothing will ever change that, and Preston understands completely. He told me I could have the biggest garden plot for next spring," Florence admitted, "and that I could help name the next foal." Faith smiled. "See, he knows you're part of the package." The summer progressed into fall, bringing cattle roundups, harvest preparations, and deepening feelings between Faith and Preston. Their courtship was simple, but meaningful: shared rides across the property, quiet conversations by firelight, occasional trips into Fort Benton for supplies that became opportunities for proper outings. Preston proved thoughtful in his attentions. He carved a delicate wooden horse for Faith's birthday, brought wildflowers when returning from boundary rides, and once arranged for a traveling photographer in Fort Benton to take a portrait of Faith and Florence together, their first ever. By harvest time, Faith had fully integrated into ranch operations. She managed the horse breeding program, kept the account books with meticulous care, and even represented the ranch at the territorial livestock auction, earning a higher price for their cattle than Preston had anticipated. "You're a natural businesswoman," he told her proudly as they rode home afterward. "My grandfather always said the true measure of a ranch's success was finding the right partner to build it with." Faith glanced at him. "Is that what we're doing, building something together?" Preston reined his horse to a stop, prompting Faith to do the same. The autumn landscape stretched around them, golden grasses waving in the breeze beneath a vast blue sky. "I hope so," he said seriously. "Because I love you, Faith Blackwell. Have almost from the beginning, I think." Though they had grown increasingly affectionate, neither had spoken those words before. Faith's heart seemed to swell within her chest. "I love you too," she replied, the truth of it resonating through her entire being. Preston dismounted and helped Faith down from her horse. Standing together on the open prairie, he took both her hands in his. "I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment," he said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small object. "It was my grandmother's." He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl. "Will you marry me, Faith?" Build a life with me here." Faith looked from the ring to his hopeful face, this man who had saved her and her sister from a terrible fate and shown them both what love and security truly meant. "Yes," she said, joy bubbling up like a spring. "Yes, Preston Pratt, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into an embrace that felt like coming home. Their wedding took place on a crisp November day, with the entire ranch and several neighbors in attendance. They held the ceremony in the main house, which May Lynn and Florence had decorated with dried autumn flowers and evergreen boughs. Faith wore a new blue dress ordered from Helena, with her mother's lace collar carefully attached. Florence stood beside her as her witness, beaming with happiness in a matching lighter blue dress. Silas Weaver, who had become something of a grandfather figure to both girls, proudly escorted Faith to where Preston waited before the minister from Fort Benton. As they exchanged vows, Faith thought of the strange journey that had brought her here, the terrible grief of losing her parents, the fear and betrayal at her uncle's hands, and then this unexpected happiness found in the most unlikely circumstances. "I, Faith Blackwell, take you, Preston Pratt, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she said clearly, her voice steady with certainty. Preston's hands held hers warmly as he repeated his own vows, his blue eyes never leaving her face. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. The celebration afterward was joyous. May Lynn had prepared a feast. The cowhands played fiddle and harmonica for dancing, and even Copper's Colt Sunrise made an appearance, led by a proudly grinning Florence. That night, after the guests had departed and Florence was settled in her room at the cabin, where she would stay until the new addition to the main house was completed, Faith found herself alone with her husband for the first time. Preston had been considerate of her nervousness, suggesting they sit before the fire and talk a while. He poured them each a small glass of whiskey, the good kind, he emphasized with a wry smile, not what your uncle preferred. Faith appreciated both his patience and his understanding of what this day meant to her, not just becoming a wife, but truly claiming her place in this new life. "I never thought I'd be grateful to Uncle Tobias for anything," she mused, watching the firelight play across Preston's features. "But if he hadn't been so terrible, we might never have met." Preston took her hand, his thumb caressing the wedding band that now accompanied her engagement ring. "Some good can come from the worst situations, I suppose." Faith set aside her barely touched whiskey and moved closer to him on the sofa. "I'm not nervous anymore," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. Preston's eyes darkened. "Faith," he said, his voice low, "I want you to be sure." In answer, she leaned forward and kissed him, putting all her love and certainty into the gesture. His response was immediate, arms encircling her as the kiss deepened into something more passionate than any they had shared before. When they finally parted, both breathless, Preston stood and offered her his hand. "Come to bed, Mrs. Pratt." Faith smiled at her new name and placed her hand in his. "Lead the way, husband." Later, as moonlight streamed through the bedroom window, Faith rested her head on Preston's chest, listening to his heartbeat. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Happy," he murmured. "Completely," she answered truthfully. In his arms, she had discovered a passion and connection that matched the love already growing between them. "And you," Preston kissed the top of her head, "more than I ever thought possible." Winter descended on Montana with spectacular force that year. Heavy snows blanketed the ranch, transforming it into a crystalline wonderland. The Triple P was well-prepared barns full of hay, storerooms stocked with preserved foods, wood piles stacked high. Faith discovered the joys of married life amid the cozy confines of winter. She and Preston developed comfortable routines: early mornings checking animals together, afternoons managing ranch business or making repairs, evenings reading aloud by the fire or simply talking until bedtime called them to more intimate pursuits. Florence flourished in their expanded family, dividing her time between helping Maylin, studying with the books Preston ordered from Helena, and planning an elaborate garden for spring. The addition to the main house was completed just before the heaviest snows, giving her a room connected to but separate from Faith and Preston's quarters, a perfect arrangement that respected her growing independence while keeping her close. Christmas brought special joy, the first truly happy holiday since their parents' death. Preston surprised Faith with a beautiful saddle crafted specifically for her, while she gave him a leather-bound journal for ranch records, hand-tooled with the Triple P brand. For Florence, they presented a full set of botanical reference books and real drawing supplies for her garden plans. As winter deepened, Faith discovered she was expecting a child. She shared the news with Preston one snowy evening as they sat before the fire. "A baby." He repeated, wonder spreading across his face. "You're certain?" Faith nodded, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. Maylin confirmed it. "She says late summer, probably August." Preston gathered her into his arms, his joy palpable. "A child," he whispered against her hair. "Our child." Florence was equally thrilled when told the next morning, immediately declaring herself ready to be the best aunt in Montana territory. As spring slowly returned to the land, bringing new calves, foals, and the first green shoots in Florence's expanded garden, Faith watched the ranch come alive with new appreciation. This land that had become her sanctuary would be her child's birthplace, his or her heritage. One warm May afternoon, as she sat on the porch mending, a wagon approached the ranch, an unusual sight outside of scheduled supply deliveries. Faith shaded her eyes, trying to identify the visitor. Preston emerged from the barn, rifle casually in hand as he always carried when unknown visitors arrived. Faith rose to stand beside him as the wagon drew closer. The driver was a middle-aged man, well-dressed but travel-worn. He pulled up before the house and removed his hat respectfully. "Afternoon," Preston called. "Something we can help you with?" "I hope so," the man replied. "I'm looking for two young women, Faith and Florence Blackwell. I was told in Fort Benton they might be here." Faith stepped forward, one protective hand on her slightly rounded belly. "I'm Faith Pratt now." "Florence is my sister. Who's asking?" The man's face registered surprise, then relief. "My name is Jonathan Blackwell. I'm your father's brother, your uncle from Boston." Faith froze. "Our father had no brother in Boston, only Tobias." The man nodded. "Half-brother, technically, different mothers. I've been searching for you both since I learned of your parents' passing. It took some time to trace you to Montana." Preston moved closer to Faith, his posture protective but not threatening. "Perhaps you'd better come inside and explain, Mr. Blackwell." Over coffee in the main house, with Florence quickly summoned from the garden, Jonathan Blackwell told his story. He was indeed their father's half-brother, 12 years younger and raised primarily in their grandmother's hometown of Boston after their father remarried. "I lost touch with your father after moving east," he explained. "It was only when settling grandmother's estate last year that I found his old letters mentioning children. I wrote immediately to his last known address in Illinois, only to learn of the tragedy." His face darkened. "Then I discovered you had been sent to Tobias. I knew him years ago, knew his character. I set out west as soon as possible." "You're rather late," Faith observed, not unkindly. "It's been over a year." Jonathan nodded regretfully. "The search took time. In Fort Benton, I heard disturbing rumors about Tobias attempting to sell 2 young women to cover drinking debts. The sheriff there confirmed you had left with a rancher named Pratt. He looked between Faith and Preston. Though I see the situation is not what I feared. Preston saved us, Florence said firmly. He bought us only to burn the contract and offer us real work. Jonathan's expression reflected both horror at what they had endured and relief at their current circumstances. I came to offer you both a home in Boston, he said. But clearly you found one here. Faith reached for Preston's hand. We have. I'm married now, expecting our first child, and Florence is thriving. Jonathan smiled sadly. Your parents would be pleased, I think, to know you found happiness despite everything. Why should we believe you're really our uncle? Florence asked suddenly. We believed Tobias too. It was a fair question. Jonathan reached into his coat and withdrew a small daguerreotype. This is your father and me as boys. And this, he produced a sealed envelope, is my banker's draft for your inheritance. Faith took the photograph with trembling hands. The resemblance was unmistakable. The young boy was clearly their father, his arm around a smaller child who had the same distinctive Blackwell eyes. Inheritance? Preston questioned. Jonathan nodded. Your grandmother left equal portions to all her grandchildren. I've been holding your shares in trust. Faith and Florence exchanged stunned glances. After everything they had endured with Tobias, this sudden appearance of legitimate family with actual financial support seemed almost too incredible to believe. Will you stay a few days? Faith finally asked. We have much to discuss, and you should rest before traveling again. Jonathan accepted gratefully. Over the next several days, he integrated seamlessly into ranch life, winning over even the skeptical Mei Lin with his genuine interest in her cooking and willingness to help with chores. Faith watched him closely, searching for any signs of deception, but found only sincerity. He shared stories of their father as a young man, filled in gaps in their family history, and expressed genuine horror upon learning the full extent of Tobias's mistreatment. He will face consequences, Jonathan promised grimly. The law may be different here, but attempting to sell human beings is still criminal. Preston, initially wary, gradually warmed to Jonathan as well. The 2 men discovered shared interests in literature and conservation practices. For ranching, on Jonathan's final evening at the Triple P, they gathered on the porch after dinner. The inheritance had been formally transferred, a sum substantial enough to provide long-term security for both sisters, though Faith insisted most of Florence's portion be held in trust until she was older. What will you do now? Faith asked her newfound uncle. Jonathan gazed out at the sunset painting the mountains. Return to Boston, though I plan to visit Montana again, perhaps next summer to meet my new grandnephew or niece. He turned to Florence. And my offer stands. If you ever wish to study in Boston, there will always be a place for you. Florence glanced at Faith and Preston before answering. Maybe someday for schooling, but this is home now. Jonathan nodded, understanding. Family takes many forms, doesn't it? I'm grateful you found yours. Later that night, as Faith and Preston prepared for bed, she found herself overcome with emotion. What is it, love? Preston asked, gathering her close. Just thinking about how much has changed, Faith replied, leaning against his strength. A year ago, I thought Florence and I had lost everything. Now we have the ranch, Jonathan, the baby coming. She looked up at her husband. Most importantly, we have you. Preston kissed her gently. I'm the fortunate one. You gave this place life, Faith. Made it more than just land and livestock. Faith placed his hand on her growing belly where their child moved. We're building something special here, aren't we? Yes, Preston agreed, his voice husky with emotion. Something that will last generations. In August, as predicted, Faith gave birth to a healthy son they named William Preston Pratt. The delivery was long but uncomplicated, with May Lynn and the doctor from Fort Benton attending. When Preston first held his son, his face reflected such wonder and love that Faith felt her heart might burst. Florence proved herself an enthusiastic aunt, already planning which flowers to plant outside the nursery window, so he learns beautiful things first. By William's christening, news had reached them that Tobias had been arrested and imprisoned for multiple counts of fraud and attempted human trafficking. Jonathan had indeed pursued justice, ensuring their former uncle could harm no one else. As autumn painted the landscape gold once more, Faith often found herself on the porch at sunset. William nestled in her arms, watching Preston and Florence work together in the corral with sunrise, now a yearling showing great promise. She thought about the cruel twist of fate that had brought them west, into Tobias's clutches, and then the miraculous turn that led them to Preston and the Triple P. From near disaster had come immeasurable joy. Preston looked up, catching her watching them. He smiled, that special smile reserved just for her, and Faith felt the now familiar warmth of belonging, of being truly home. 5 years later, the Triple P ranch had prospered beyond anyone's expectations. Their cattle operation had expanded, their horse breeding program had gained territorial recognition, and the main house had grown to accommodate their increasing family. William, now an active 5-year-old with his father's blue eyes and his mother's quiet determination, had been joined by 3-year-old twins Sarah and Samuel. The children thrived in the freedom of ranch life, already showing aptitude for riding and developing their own distinct personalities. Florence, now 19, had blossomed into a confident young woman. After completing advanced studies with a tutor in Helena, she had developed the ranch's garden into a small but profitable herb and flower business, supplying medicinal plants to doctors and settlements throughout the territory. She had also caught the attention of the new schoolteacher in Fort Benton, a scholarly young man who rode out to the Triple P with increasing frequency, ostensibly to borrow books from Preston's growing library. Jonathan visited each summer, bringing gifts from the east and updates on the expanding railroad lines that were transforming the territories. His most recent visit had brought news of Tobias's death in prison, a chapter finally closed. Faith and Preston's partnership had deepened with each passing year. They ran the ranch as true equals, each respecting the other's strengths. Their love, which had begun in such unusual circumstances, had matured into something unshakable, a foundation upon which they built their family and their future. One evening in late summer, as they sat together on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Preston took Faith's hand. "Do you ever think about that day in Fort Benton?" he asked quietly. "When I saw your uncle with that contract," Faith nodded, the memory no longer painful. "Sometimes it seems like another lifetime now." Preston's thumb traced the wedding band he'd placed on her finger years before. "I never told you this, but I almost didn't go into town that day. Had planned to send Silas instead." Faith turned to look at him, struck by how different their lives might have been. "What changed your mind?" Preston smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes crinkling in the way she loved. "Copper threw a shoe, needed to get her a new one fitted." Faith laughed softly. "So we owe our happiness to a horse. Seems fitting for a ranch family," Preston replied, pulling her closer against his side. "Though I prefer to think it was fate." Faith rested her head on his shoulder, watching as William showed his younger siblings how to pet a new foal under Florence's watchful eye. The setting sun gilded everything in golden light: the buildings they had expanded together, the land they had nurtured, the family they had created. Not fate, Faith corrected gently. Choice. You chose to help when you could have looked away. I chose to trust when I had every reason not to. Preston pressed a kiss to her temple. Best choice I ever made. Mine too, Faith whispered, her heart full. From the darkest day of her life had come this extraordinary journey, a journey that had led her not just to safety, but to love, family, and a place to truly belong. As twilight settled over the Triple P Ranch, Faith Pratt looked at the life she and Preston had built from such unlikely beginnings and knew with absolute certainty they had not just survived, they had triumphed.